December 31st, 1896, Dortmund, Germany. On this day, a baby girl is born into an ordinary German family. She will be named Helen. Years will pass. She will become a nurse and learn how to save human lives. She will marry a miner named Friedrich. They will settle in Western Germany and have 2 children, an ordinary woman, an ordinary law-abiding German working-class family, just like so many families around them. But beginning in 1933, something begins to change. Neighbors who greeted Helen only yesterday suddenly start turning away. They stop acknowledging her on the street. They avoid the family as if they were contagious. Even the air in her hometown seems different, heavy, hostile. In 1936, her husband was arrested. In 1937, they came for her. A search, the Gestapo. She is brutally and mercilessly beaten with metal rods. At the time, Helen was pregnant. As the result of the beating, she loses her unborn child. Like other Jehovah's Witnesses, she was required to wear a purple triangle, a small piece of fabric that would set her apart from the rest. On August 4th, 1944, the Sixth Senate of the Nazi People's Court, the Volksgerichtshof, sentenced Helen Gotthold and other Jehovah's Witnesses to death. On December 8th, 1944, Helen was executed by guillotine at Berlin Plötzensee prison. Helen's life was cut short, but her tragic story remained. And by all indications, the ideology that led to her execution did not remain in the past and continues to exist today. Anyone with even a trace of empathy is inevitably left with one question after hearing this story. Why? The answer is tragic in its simplicity. Helen was one of Jehovah's Witnesses. But why did this religious affiliation cause the Nazi regime to send Jehovah's Witnesses, alongside Jews and political prisoners, to prisons and concentration camps, and often to their deaths? They were not persecuted on racial grounds. The primary targets of the Nazis' racial genocide were Jews. About 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany, its allies, and its collaborators. Jehovah's Witnesses, by contrast, were generally not categorized by Nazi ideology as racially inferior. The Nazi authorities persecuted them primarily because their religious beliefs did not allow them to give the Nazi salute, swear allegiance to the regime, or, most importantly, take up arms and kill. They adhered to the principle of Christian neutrality. For this reason, they were placed on lists of sects. Their organization was banned, their literature was confiscated, and they were designated as a special category of persecuted people within the police and concentration camp systems. Notice how this persecution unfolded. It did not begin with the guillotine. Jehovah's Witnesses were gradually turned into objects of suspicion for both the churches and the police. In church apologetics publications, they were presented as a dangerous sect, while Nazi state documents identified them as Bibelforscher, or Bible students, a group to be monitored, banned, and persecuted. They were systematically discredited in the eyes of the public. Even before Hitler came to power, church apologetics organizations had been collecting information about them and turning other believers against them. After 1933, these materials became part of a broader system of state surveillance. Jehovah's Witnesses then began to lose their jobs. The authorities took children away from their parents and sent them to other schools, orphanages, reform institutions, or foster families so that they could be raised as good Germans, as the Nazi state understood the term. The parents themselves were sent to prisons and concentration camps. There, they were given a camp badge, the purple triangle, the identifying mark assigned to imprisoned Jehovah's Witnesses. This was the only concentration camp badge used to mark prisoners specifically because of their religious beliefs. Behind that patch lay interrogations, beatings, forced labor, starvation, and years of imprisonment. The authorities repeatedly tried to break them. They were offered the chance to sign a declaration renouncing their faith and acknowledging the authority of the Nazi regime. Most refused. Some were killed by the brutal conditions of the concentration camp system. Others, especially those who refused military service, were sentenced to death. At this point, many will likely think, but that was Nazi Germany, a different era, a time of extraordinary brutality, war, dictatorship, and mass death. All of that remained there in the 1930s and 40s, in archives, in museums, and in the family memories passed down from our grandparents and great-grandparents. Well, let's check whether this truly belongs only to the past, to see whether the mechanisms themselves have disappeared, or whether they have merely changed their language, form, and geographic location. To do this, let us move from Germany in the 1930s and 40s to the year 2026 and turn our attention to a different point on the map. February 3rd, 2026, Dimitrovgrad, Russia. Early that morning, the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, conducted searches at least 4 homes of Jehovah's Witnesses. 57-year-old Zhana Popova opened the door to masked officers, one of whom entered the house, knocked her to the floor, and injured her knee. Popova testified that it was minus 25 degrees Celsius outside that day, making the hallway extremely cold, and she was only wearing a nightgown. In that condition, FSB officers pinned her to the floor while she trembled from the shock and cold. Not understanding who these men were or what they wanted. During the search, one of the officers led Igor Popov into an unheated entryway, forced him face down onto the floor, and struck him repeatedly in the back while forcibly twisting his neck. After the search, Popov was taken to the FSB building, where he was handcuffed, stripped, beaten, and repeatedly subjected to electric shocks. The investigator then tried to force him to sign a pre-written, self-incriminating statement and agree to cooperate with the investigation. Tell me, doesn't this remind you of anything? Doesn't it seem as though history is repeating itself? Different countries, different centuries, but it all began the same way, long before the gas chambers and the mass shootings of innocent people. Will the consequences be the same as back then? Perhaps you will be able to answer that question by watching this episode to the end. For decades, historians, philosophers, and human rights advocates have grappled with the question that, at first glance, seems impossible to answer. How did what happened in Germany during the 1930s and 1940s become possible? How did officers, soldiers, and government officials come to embrace Hitler's ideology? And how did an entire nation, the nation of Goethe, Kant, and Beethoven, accept the idea that human beings could be divided into the superior and inferior? How did German citizens come to accept that a neighbor could first be deprived of a job, then property, and finally, life itself? After all, this did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, and at every stage, society accepted it. At the same time, it would be historically inaccurate and morally unjust to claim that all Germans, without exception, embraced Nazi ideology. There were also people in Germany who did not accept the regime, resisted it, rescued those who were being persecuted, or became victims of the Nazis themselves. However, for the purposes of this analysis, what is essential is something else. Mass crimes become possible not when absolutely everyone agrees with them, but when a critical mass of society accepts the rules imposed by the regime. Another part adapts them out of fear, conformity, or career calculation, while the rest are intimidated, isolated, or deprived of any opportunity to change anything. It is precisely at that moment that an ideology ceases to be the opinion of one group and becomes a social norm, while exclusion, discrimination, and violence begin to be perceived as acceptable, justified, and sometimes even necessary. But the main question of today's episode is different. What if the mechanism that led to genocide in the 20th century is not just part of history preserved in museums, archives, and the memories of the last surviving witnesses? What if individual elements of that mechanism are being reproduced right now, before our very eyes? Not necessarily through explicit calls for the destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, but under the guise of protecting society from destructive groups. And what if this rhetoric and these practices can be found not only in Russia, but also across Europe and the United States, where they often appear not as an ideology of hatred, but as expert opinions, parliamentary reports, lists of dangerous organizations, court rulings, and administrative measures. There is a belief that Nazism became possible because one society, during one period in history, happened to contain an unusually large number of evil people, as if Germany and the German people were somehow different in this respect. Psychological and historical research over the past 70 years points to the opposite conclusion. Support for Nazi ideology among part of German society was not the result of some uniquely German cruelty. It was the product of recognizable and repeatable mechanisms: obedience to authority, conformity, the gradual normalization of discrimination, and the cognitive dehumanization of a targeted group. These mechanisms become especially dangerous whenever the state or influential institutions begin, at either the ideological or the executive level, to divide people into categories and attach labels such as dangerous element or cult member. In other words, what happened to the neighbors of Helen Gotthold, whom I mentioned at the beginning, can happen in any society if a certain mechanism is set in motion and if society accepts it. To understand how this mechanism works, it is important to understand what dehumanization is. Simply put, dehumanization is a psychological and social process in which an individual or an entire group ceases to be perceived as equal, as human beings with their own feelings, reason, dignity, fears, pain, families, and inner lives. This is precisely what dehumanization is. Under normal circumstances, most people find it difficult to harm another human being. They are held back by empathy, a sense of human dignity, and an internal moral prohibition against violence. Dehumanization weakens this prohibition. When a group of people begins to be described not as human beings, but as a contagion, parasites, a threat, dirt, a dangerous element, or simply as a faceless mass, violence against them becomes easier to see not as a crime, but as the protection of society, a sanitary measure, or the elimination of a threat. This is precisely how this dangerous mechanism works. First, the language changes, then perception changes, and then the boundary of what is considered acceptable shifts. What seemed unthinkable yesterday gradually comes to be perceived as necessary. Psychologist Nick Haslam, in his peer-reviewed article, Dehumanization, an Integrative Review, identifies two primary forms of dehumanization. The first is animalistic dehumanization. People are denied uniquely human qualities, reason, culture, moral maturity, and self-control, and are portrayed as inferior, primitive, filthy, instinct-driven, or animal-like beings. The second is mechanistic dehumanization. People are stripped of human nature, feelings, kindness, individuality, and inner life, and are portrayed as cold, emotionless objects or machines. The first form of dehumanization was particularly important, especially in its most radical form. Jews were portrayed not only as inferior or animal-like, but also as parasites, lice, a source of disease and infection. One German propaganda poster in occupied Poland explicitly declared, "Jews are lice. They cause typhus." Such language turned people into a public health threat, and violence against them, in the eyes of society, became easier to present as cleansing, quarantine, or the protection of the nation. Despite their different forms, the effect of dehumanization remains the same. It weakens moral sensitivity to the suffering of another human being. When a person or a group ceases to be perceived as fully human, the customary mechanisms of moral restraint begin to break down, and inflicting harm begins to seem acceptable, justified, and sometimes even necessary. David Livingstone Smith, in his book Less Than Human, demonstrates, using examples from Nazi propaganda, that dehumanization is not merely the language of insults. It is a way of pushing an entire group outside the boundaries of the community of fully human people, of portraying them not as human beings, but as creatures of a lower order, vermin, parasites, lice, cockroaches, contagion, or subhumans. It is precisely this kind of language, as Smith emphasizes, that accompanied slavery, the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and other forms of mass violence. Later, these conclusions were also confirmed by social neuroscience research. Studies on the perception of extremely stigmatized outgroups found reduced activation of the medial prefrontal cortex, a brain region linked to spontaneous social cognition and mentalizing, that is, perceiving another person as a subject with thoughts, feelings, and an inner life. In a study by Lasana Harris and Susan Fisk, such a response was observed when participants viewed the most despised groups, those whom they stereotypically assessed as both cold and incompetent. At the same time, activity increased in brain regions associated with disgust, including the insular cortex and the amygdala. In other words, dehumanization alters not only public language, how the state, the media, and experts describe the target group, but also the very perception of that group. Behind the label, it becomes increasingly difficult to see a person as a subject with their own thoughts, feelings, pain, and the right to compassion. Therefore, images of animals, parasites, zombies, infection, or a disease in the body of society are not merely crude metaphors. Under conditions of propaganda, they become tools of moral exclusion. They help present violence no longer as a crime against a human being, but as protection, cleansing, or the elimination of a threat. But before violence arises, division comes first. Henry Tushfel's work demonstrated that even the minimal division of people into groups, based on random, almost arbitrary criteria, can generate a preference for one's own group and less favorable attitudes toward other groups. In the classic minimal group paradigm experiments, participants divided into arbitrary categories began distributing resources in favor of their own group. Even though there was no real conflict, personal gain, or prior enmity between the groups. This is precisely why intergroup alienation does not necessarily begin with direct calls for violence. It can begin with a simple division into us and them, especially when this division is subsequently reinforced by the state, propaganda, experts, the media, or the judicial system. In Nazi Germany, this mechanism took on an extremely rigid political form. The regime constructed the myth of a unified people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft, and simultaneously define those who were to be excluded from it: Jews, Roma, people with disabilities, political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, and other groups declared undesirable, alien, or enemies of the state. Nazi ideology indeed sought to present the people's community as a unified whole, purified of everyone the regime deemed racially, biologically, politically, or socially undesirable. The dehumanization of Jews and the demonization of other declared enemies served two purposes at once. On the one hand, they strengthened the imagined unity of those whom the regime included in the category of us. On the other hand, they lowered the psychological barrier to persecuting those who were placed outside this us. Nazi propaganda portrayed Jews not only as inferior, but also as dangerous enemies of the Reich. Communists, social democrats, and trade union activists were among the first political groups to suffer persecution. The Nazi authorities also declared Jehovah's Witnesses to be enemies of the state. The more dangerous, alien, and less than human they were portrayed to be, the more united, defensive, and morally justified we were supposed to feel. Thus, the language of exclusion turned repression not into a crime against human beings, but into a supposedly necessary protection of the people's community. The next stage is described by Susan Apatow in her article, Moral Exclusion and Injustice, an introduction as the scope of justice, a psychological boundary within which a person or group is recognized as deserving of moral respect, fair treatment, and legal protection. As long as a group remains within these boundaries, harming its members is perceived as an injustice. But when the group is gradually pushed beyond them, for example, through labels such as sect, enemy of the people, dangerous element, or totalitarian cult, discrimination, the deprivation of rights, and even violence begin to be perceived differently, no longer as a crime against equal human beings, but as an even acceptable measure, punishment, or even the protection of society. That is precisely why Helen Gotthold's neighbors, who refused to have anything to do with her family after the Nazis came to power, may well not have considered themselves villains. In their worldview, Helen was no longer just a neighbor, a mother, and a woman of faith. She had become a cult member, politically disloyal, or an enemy of the state. In other words, she had become someone whom they had already, in their own minds, pushed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human attitude. So how does an ordinary person, who considers themselves decent and moral, gradually begin to support a repressive ideology? Or, at the very least, silently accept it? One of the answers was proposed as early as 1954 by the Harvard psychologist Gordon Allport in his book, The Nature of Prejudice. He described the scale of prejudice, a series of stages of escalation showing how intolerance progresses from hostile words to social avoidance, then to discrimination, violence, and, at its extreme, extermination. The first stage consists of hostile words, labels, ridicule, and rumors about them. The second is avoidance. Society begins to keep its distance from them. The third is discrimination. They are deprived of rights, jobs, and opportunities. The fourth is physical violence. The fifth is extermination. The main point of this scale is not that society inevitably goes through all the stages in order. Rather, it is that each preceding form of hostility lowers the moral barrier to the next. Words facilitate avoidance. Avoidance leads to discrimination. Discrimination leads to violence. And violence, if justified and gradually normalized, can lead to the destruction of people. Society rarely begins with the final stage. Instead, it moves forward gradually, each time agreeing only to what seems small, reasonable, or temporary, simply to apply a label, simply to distance itself, simply to impose restrictions, simply to isolate, simply to restore order. How does each subsequent step become established? In social psychology, a similar mechanism was described by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser as the foot in the door technique. A person who agrees to a small request is more likely to agree to a larger one afterward. Later, Robert Cialdini explained this effect through the principle of commitment and consistency, people's tendency to remain internally consistent with their previous choices. Applied to Nazi Germany, this does not explain the Holocaust in its entirety, but it helps us understand the psychology of gradual habituation. Society did not immediately find itself confronted with the reality of mass extermination. First, Jews were excluded from the civil service and certain professions. Then their rights were restricted. They were pushed out of public life and stripped of citizenship, property, and legal protection. Then came public marking, the yellow star, a symbol of humiliation, control, and preparation for further isolation. And history remembers the final stage of this tragedy all too well. Each step did not make the next one inevitable, but it lowered the moral barrier to it. What had seemed unthinkable yesterday, after a series of small, legal, and administrative measures, began to be perceived as a continuation of an already established order. Next, the mechanism that Albert Bandura called moral disengagement begins to operate. It refers to a cognitive process in which a destructive act comes to be perceived not as evil, but as a morally justified, neutral, or even necessary measure. Violence comes to be called protection, discrimination, prevention, the deprivation of rights, restoring order, while responsibility is shifted onto superiors, the law, circumstances, or even the victim. Within this logic, each subsequent step no longer appears to be a crime, but rather a continuation of what had previously been accepted as permissible. That is why gradual involvement changes not only behavior, it also reshapes the moral evaluation of what is happening. A related mechanism is cognitive dissonance, described by Leon Festinger. Once a person has supported the first unjust decision, an internal conflict arises between their actions and their view of themselves as a decent person. One way to reduce this tension is not to admit a mistake, but to justify one's own actions, to blame the victim, downplay the harm, or convince oneself that there was no other choice. The theory of cognitive dissonance is precisely about this. People strive to restore internal consistency between their beliefs, their self-image, and their own actions. This is how complicity becomes entrenched, not only externally, but internally as well. A person gradually reconstructs their own moral framework so that exclusion, discrimination, or violence already committed comes to seem just, reasonable, and even necessary. Remember these stages, the 5 stages of Alport's scale. We will go through them once again, but not in Nazi Germany, but in today's reality. But first, we must answer the question, who applies the label today? Who utters that very word that marks the beginning of the first stage? The word that initially seems like just an opinion, but can later become the basis for exclusion, discrimination, persecution, and even violence. We began with Jehovah's Witnesses, a group that, in Nazi Germany, was classified among the dangerous sects. The Bible students, Bibelforscher. Today, the label sect or destructive cult is rarely assigned by accident. There is a view that the fight against sects is primarily an initiative of concerned relatives. Historically, that element did exist. But the modern anti-cult movement has long included more than just private activists. It comprises national associations, expert centers, international federations, conferences, government institutions, and consultants to government authorities. Researchers note that anti-cult organizations are well organized in the United States and across Europe, and have even integrated unscientific concepts of mind control by dangerous sects into the public policy of certain countries. And this network has a recognizable center of influence. According to the available body of evidence, the chief ideologue of this network is Alexander Dworkin. Human rights organizations and researchers describe him as one of the central figures behind the systematic campaign of pressure against new religious movements in Russia. From open sources, one can construct a coherent picture of who Alexander Dworkin is and what his role is on the international anti-cult scene. In 1993, after spending more than 10 years in the United States, he returned to Russia and, under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church, founded a center allegedly dealing with issues related to so-called cults. In that same year, 1993, he introduced the term totalitarian cult, combining Western anti-cult concepts with the Soviet tradition of state control over religion. He is the president of Ratsiers, an organization that brings together many so-called anti-cult centers, both in Russia and abroad, as well as the missionary departments of dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church. Beginning in 2009, he headed the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation under the Russian Ministry of Justice. In that same year, 2009, he was appointed vice president of the European Federation FECRIS, which, in turn, had long been one of the key centers of the anti-cult movement in European countries. And one more significant fact, documented by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF, for many years, Dworkin actively lobbied for strict anti-cult legislation in Russia, using corresponding anti-cult terminology and narratives. Note the structure of this network. One individual coordinates the network from Moscow, but his influence extends throughout Europe, through the European Anti-Cult Federation FECRIS. British experts, Czech and Slovak activists, and journalists working in this field, and French, German, Latvian, Belgian, and American organizations are all connected by a single thread of destructive methodology that leads back to a single individual. What else is known about Dworkin? I will present what has been recorded in open sources. First, the question of mental health. In 2014, documents appeared in the public domain which, according to a number of sources, indicate that Alexander Dworkin underwent treatment at a neuropsychiatric dispensary in the mid-1970s. Among the diagnoses mentioned were cyclothymia, a disorder of the manic-depressive spectrum, pathological personality development, and psychic infantilism. It is important to note that Dworkin's lawyer called these documents forged. However, the defense's position turned out to be contradictory. It was first claimed that the documents were fake. Then it was stated that the diagnosis was temporary and caused by stress. And later still, that the reason Dworkin had sought treatment at the dispensary was allegedly to avoid military service. I am not making diagnoses. That is outside my competence. But there is a fact that I believe is important to note. A person with such a public medical diagnosis determines which religious organizations in the country should be considered dangerous. Second, there are a number of facts that I must note, but I will leave it to you to draw your own conclusions. On the official website of the center headed by Dworkin, the list of recommended resources includes a link to the website of Anton Hein, a man who, according to court records, pleaded guilty in California in 1994 to charges of lewd acts involving his 13-year-old niece, and subsequently violated the terms of his release and fled from U.S. justice. This same individual, convicted of sexual offense against a minor, also appears among the recommended resources of Stephen Hassan, one of the best-known figures in the American anti-cult movement. It is precisely with this Western anti-cult milieu that, according to the available evidence, the key concepts that Dvorkin later brought into Russian cult studies are connected. I discussed this in detail in the previous episode. The network in which Dvorkin is described as one of the leading figures includes individuals such as Jorge Erdeligram, a member of the advisory board of the American Anti-Cult Organization, ICSA. In Mexico, he faced charges of establishing a network of shelters through which, according to the prosecution, child trafficking was allegedly carried out. The network also includes the Czech activist Jakub Jal, against whom a criminal case has been opened on charges of the sexual abuse of minors in Tanzania. This information is documented in films about his activities. I will simply place these facts side by side and point out one pattern. The filter of danger and threat that the anti-cult network applies to those it brands as sects and cults is not applied to its own members. This is how an asymmetry emerges. Outsiders are declared the source of manipulation and danger, while similar actions by its own members are described as the protection of society. In the theory of dangerous speech, this closely resembles the technique of mirror accusation. A target group is accused of precisely the threat attributed to it in order to justify one's own repressive actions. There is another pattern, well known in criminology and behavioral analysis. An environment built on secrecy, mutual loyalty, and a sense of impunity tends to attract and retain individuals with similar characteristics. Put simply, if figures associated with child abuse and other serious forms of abuse appear around the same network, it ceases to look like a series of coincidences. It begins to look like a pattern, not as proof of each and every participant's guilt, but as a troubling indicator of the organizational environment itself. And here, I'm compelled to return to what this series of videos began with. I'm referring to the book Maniac Against God by former FBI profiler James Ressler, as well as to the psychobiographical and profiling analysis conducted by independent journalists. According to these materials and their analytical interpretation, the biography of Alexander Dvorkin contains a number of indications that these authors associate with possible serious crimes, including the sexual abuse of a child and a series of premeditated murders. I analyzed these sources in detail in a separate episode and will not repeat that analysis here. But it is important to define the scope of the analysis right away. I'm merely describing what others have analyzed and published, based on Dvorkin's own autobiographical writings, third-party testimony, medical records, and comparative analysis. Whether these conclusions reflect reality is not for me or for you to decide. This is the responsibility of the relevant specialists. However, I will allow myself to make one observation. When an individual whose biography independent researchers associate with themes of violence, control, and power over helpless victims, including children, finds themselves at the head of a network that includes a convicted pedophile evading justice, the organizer of a network of shelters accused of child trafficking, and an activist against whom there is documented testimony alleging the rape of minors, then all these so-called coincidences, which can hardly be called coincidences anymore, give serious cause for reflection. Because there is a simple principle in behavioral analysis. One coincidence might be an accident. Two are a reason to take a closer look. But a sequence of multiple reoccurring indicators is, as a rule, no longer a coincidence. It is a profile. However, behind the profile of any individual, there is always something greater: the environment that shaped that person, and the tradition that shaped that environment. One person, no matter how great their influence, could not single-handedly create a stable international network. One with organizations, experts, conferences, methodological materials, and channels of interaction with government institutions. Therefore, it is now worth returning to the questions I left open at the end of the previous episode. The answers show that what Dworkin does can hardly be called a method of his own. Rather, it is a continuation and adaptation of existing methods: stigmatization, the reinforcement of the cult label by pseudo-experts, the creation of an image of threat, and the subsequent administrative or judicial pressure on groups that the same network declares to be dangerous. I promised to tell you about the prototype Dworkin relied upon when creating his anti-sectarian St. Irenaeus of Lyons Center. Here is my answer. The organization that systematically compiled lists of dangerous sects was created not in the 1970s in the US, as is often believed in studies of the anti-cult movement, nor in the 1990s in Russia, but in 1921 in Germany. Sources indicate that it was called the Apologetics Center and was established within the Protestant Church. Officially, it was meant to inform believers about other religious movements. In practice, the center began collecting dossiers on various religious, philosophical, and social associations, exactly as was stated when Alexander Dworkin's center was founded. But the history of this runs even deeper. The ideological foundation for religious intolerance in German Protestantism was laid by Martin Luther himself, a man who demanded the death penalty for Christians who interpreted doctrine differently than he did, and who wrote the book On the Jews and Their Lies, in which he called for synagogues to be burned. It is important to note that Hitler called Luther the greatest genius of the German people. Researchers point out that it was specifically church-based anti-Semitism that exerted a significant influence on the formation of German nationalist movements long before Hitler's radicalism took shape as an ideology. In 1932, the Apologetics Center was headed by the Protestant pastor Walter Künneth, an outspoken anti-Semite, and this is where the most important part of our story begins. On April 26, 1933, Künneth presented a report titled The Church and the Jewish Question, in which he called for the elimination of Jewry, describing it as a foreign cell in the body of Germany. Soon, one particular government agency became interested in the methods and archives of the Apologetics Center. This is the answer to the second question I left open in the previous episode. The lists of dangerous sects had found a new and extremely interested user: the Gestapo. Künneth himself reported with satisfaction to the leadership of the Reich Church.
The Gestapo expressed great interest in the Apologetics Center's archive of sects. The exchange of materials between the Gestapo and the Apologetics Center has already begun.
In Susanna Heschel's book, The Aryan Jesus, it is noted that theologians provided Nazism with a pseudo-scientific justification. The establishment in 1939 of the Institute for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence on German church life is a direct example of how academic institutions legitimize state violence through expertise. Aren't activists within Dworkin's network in Russia implementing the very same mechanism today? But let us return to the phrase, the exchange of materials has already begun. What made this cooperation so detrimental? In fact, from that point on, the Apologetics Center supplied the Reich Ministry of the Interior Joseph Goebbels, Ministry of Propaganda, and the Gestapo with materials on the political positions of various religious communities. As historian Horst Junginger notes, whereas in 1931, the center's archive contained about 150 ideological communities. By 1936, it already included about 500 groups and sects classified as dangerous. I would like to remind you that Alexander Dworkin's official website contains approximately the same number of entries. However, given that his followers in other countries often establish their own centers and expand this list of alleged sects and cults, the total number may be considerably higher. The culmination of the cooperation between the Apologetics Center and the Gestapo came in the form of a directive signed by Reinhard Heydrich, the very directive that established the procedure for suppressing certain religious communities and sending people associated with them to concentration camps. It was this directive that ultimately led to the death sentence imposed on Helen Gotthold, whose tragic story opened today's video. I ask you to pause for a moment and reflect on what you have heard. Consider this. Who compiled the lists used to send innocent people to death camps? Can we conclude from these facts that the Gestapo committed its brutal crimes on the basis of those very lists? And the lists themselves were kindly compiled by cult experts, Kunith's Apologetics Center, fighters against dissent? Now, for the answer to the third question I left at the end of the previous episode. How did Kunith's legacy reach the present day? After the war, in 1964, the Protestant Church in Bavaria officially reinstated the position of the Commissioner for Sect Affairs and appointed Pastor Friedrich Wilhelm Haack to the post. Haack studied Protestant theology in Nuremberg during the very years when Kunith was teaching there. According to a number of sources, he can be regarded as Kunith's ideological successor and the principal ideologue of the anti-cult movement in post-war Europe. In many respects, the old pattern was reproduced once again. First came the study of religious movements, under the pretext of gathering information. Then came the campaign against them. In the early 1970s, at Haack's initiative, a name from the Nazi era was revived. Working Group on Religious and Ideological Issues, which almost literally repeated the Nazi-era title, Department for Religious and Ideological Affairs of the Reich Main Security Office. Then, in 1990, Haack compiled a blacklist of new religious movements that the German authorities used for the following 16 years. Here is his own credo, one that rejected the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
If we understand our faith correctly, we do not have the right to allow the others to continue in their faith.
One source also described that after one of Haack's sermons about a group he classified as a sect, the following shouts were heard.
Shoot them all! Hang them! Heil Hitler!
This was 1988, 43 years after the fall of the Third Reich. Here, it is necessary to note a fact that I promised to examine in the previous episode. The University of California's Calisphere Digital Archive contains an inventory of documents from the Cult Awareness Network, CAN, a major U.S. anti-cult organization that ceased to exist as a result of lawsuits brought against it. This inventory is a catalog of the physical materials held in the archive. To view the contents of specific folders, one must contact the archive directly. But even this inventory reveals something important. In the section Series D, CAN-related groups and individuals, Box 88, separate folders are devoted to Ted Patrick, the founder of the practice of forcibly abducting and confining people who were labeled as cultists. Stephen Hassan, an anti-cult activist closely associated with this practice, whom I discussed in detail in the previous video, and Friedrich Wilhelm Haack, the ideological successor to the ideology that once supplied the Gestapo with lists of targets for persecution. The very fact that Can maintained a separate file on each of them shows that the Can archive contains, side by side, three key figures of the anti-cult movement, and that one of them is the ideological successor to those who compiled lists for the Gestapo. But Haack did not act alone. Together with the Danish theologian Johannes Aagaard, he founded an international organization, the Dialogue Center. Aagaard, by the way, publicly mocked Americans' commitment to the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, calling this phenomenon First Amendment neurosis. And if you recall, the previous episode mentioned that Ted Patrick, the man known as the father of deprogramming, expressed a similar view. It is he who is associated with the violent anti-cult practice of kidnapping and confining people against their will under the pretext of saving them from sex. When he was reminded that such methods violated the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment, he replied that religious freedom was, in his words, one of the biggest rackets the world has ever known. And here is the final link in this chain. The best-known student of Johannes Aagaard, by common acknowledgement, was a man who returned to Russia from immigration in 1991. In one interview, he himself stated that he had collaborated with the Cult Awareness Network, and in 1993, he traveled to Denmark, worked in the archives of that very apologetic center, and, by his own account, brought back suitcases full of photocopies that became the foundation of the Russian organization he established and of his subsequent activities. He also became vice president of the Dialogue Center International. The name of that man is already well known to you, Alexander Dworkin. This line can be traced with remarkable consistency from the Nazi sect expert who collaborated with the Gestapo through the post-war German ideologue of the international anti-cult movement, to the Russian expert who, according to published medical records, has documented mental disorders and who pursues bans on religious minorities. It reflects a persistent institutional model. The expert provides a pseudo-scientific justification. The state uses it for persecution. Kenneth called Judaism a foreign cell in the body of Germany. And these are quotes from Hitler.
Letter to Konstantin Hierl. Salzburg speech.
And now listen to how Alexander Dworkin describes organizations that he classifies as sects.
Cults do not enrich people. They only drain society of its juices. All of this resembles a cancerous tumor that drains out juices from the human body until it kills it.
And here is what Alexander Novopashin, an archpriest of the Russian Orthodox Church and Alexander Dworkin's right-hand man, says.
Just as in a body, as soon as a single cell becomes infected, metastases begin from it. Totalitarian sects are a social infection, and the spread of this contagion must be stopped.
Dworkin described his book as a vaccine against sectarian deception. Goebbels called anti-Jewish measures hygienic and preventive. Doesn't it seem to you that they both construct their rhetoric in a way that presents intervention as a protective measure rather than an aggressive one? Do you understand what this means? Decades later, in another country, from the mouths of people associated with the state expert structures and the church anti-cult milieu, the same dehumanizing metaphors are sounding once again. The same ones that once accompanied Nazi propaganda and the Holocaust. the same image of a disease that must be eradicated and excised. A coincidence? Or the recognizable signature of the same ideology, within which a human being first ceases to be a human being and becomes a disease. This is precisely why I bring up these topics, because we think that the horrors of Nazism remain in the past, that such a thing cannot happen again, cannot be happening here and now. Someone might think, we are a different society. We remember those atrocities and will not allow them to happen again. It seems to us that we can never simply agree to people being destroyed. And that is true. Just like that, in a single day. To agree to destruction? No, we couldn't. But gradually, step by step, one step at a time, would you say no? Let's conduct a small experiment right now. Think for a second. What do you feel when you hear the words cult member, sect, or cult? Fear? Disdain? Alertness? A sense of threat? Repulsion? Everyone will have their own answer. Perhaps for some, they will be similar. I will put that feeling into my own words. Everything you just experienced is merely a marker, a signal that tells your consciousness, this group or this person, they are different, separate from me. They are not like me. As a rule, this feeling is reinforced by ready-made images, the ones produced by the media wing of that very same transnational anti-cult network. Images of dangerous cult members, completely deprived of free will, brainwashed people who blindly carry out orders. But let us stop right here and honestly answer a few questions for ourselves. Do you actually know this for a fact? Have you spoken to these people personally? Do you know their lives, their beliefs? Have you checked whether what is said about them reflects reality? Or did you simply hear it from someone else? Read a newspaper headline? Stumbled upon a video by an internet blogger with a frightening title, Cult? No matter how you answer these questions, at the foundation of it all lies a single division, I and they. And this is precisely what the activists of the anti-cult network are striving for. Their goal is for you, once you accept the label of cultist, to take the next, almost imperceptible step, to agree that you are better than this person, that you are superior, and that this cult member is something inferior, as if they are no longer quite human. And it is right here that I must warn you. By supporting such a line of thinking, by accepting such an ideology of superiority, you may not even realize what you are being drawn into, because the consequences of that agreement could prove to be catastrophic. Do you want to know what happens next? What awaits a country when society accepts this ideology, while a transnational anti-cult network is already operating within it? Let us return once again to Alport's scale. Remember how this happened in Germany. The laws did not come down on people in a single day. They appeared gradually, step by step. 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Jews were dismissed from the civil service, from universities, and from the courts. Then, restrictions on Jewish students. Then, the revocation of citizenship for undesirable elements. Then, a ban on working in the press. 1935, the Nuremberg race laws. Deprivation of citizenship. A ban on marriage. They bear the signature of Reich Minister of the Interior Wilhelm Frick. 1938, mandatory registration of property. The forced addition of the names Israel and Sarah to the documents of Jews. A red letter J, a derogatory mark in the passports of Jews. 1941, the compulsory wearing of the yellow Star of David, and only then, 1942, the Wannsee Conference, the final solution. It was there that Nazi officials coordinated the bureaucratic implementation of what the regime called the final solution to the Jewish question. This policy led to the murder of approximately 6 million European Jews. At the same time, the Nazi regime also persecuted and murdered millions of other people: Roma, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, and members of other groups. Think about it. Not every measure looked like a step toward mass murder from the very beginning. In the first 6 years of the dictatorship, from 1933 to 1939, more than 400 laws, decrees, and regulations were imposed on the Jews. They gradually stripped them of their rights, property, employment, and place in society. This gradualism can be viewed as one of the methods of bypassing moral barriers. Society was not conditioned to accept destruction all at once, but rather conditioned first to accept exclusion, simply firing, simply restricting, simply separating, simply labeling. Each new step did not make the next one inevitable, but it made it psychologically and administratively more likely. What would have caused shock at the beginning, after a chain of legal and temporary measures, began to be perceived as a continuation of an order that had already been accepted. And now let us look at Russia, the country where the center of the entire anti-cult network is located, led by its ideologue, Alexander Dworkin. Stage 1. Division. On September 26, 1997, Russia signed the federal law on freedom of conscience and religious associations. Formally, it is a law on freedom of religion in a secular state. But its very preamble establishes a different framework. It recognizes the special role of orthodoxy in the history of Russia and in the establishment and development of its spirituality and culture, and then, separately, mentions Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, and other religions as an inseparable part of the historical heritage of the peoples of Russia. Thus, a symbolic hierarchy was built into the text of a law devoted to the equality of religious associations. One religion was given the status of special. Others were recognized as historically established, while all the rest were effectively placed outside this privileged circle. What emerges here is not a direct prohibition, but a much subtler mechanism for dividing people into our own, the traditional, and those whose legitimacy can now be called into question. This can be regarded as the legal institutionalization of the division into us and them. It is precisely the phenomenon Gordon Allport described as the first stage in the escalation of prejudice and discrimination in society, and that Tajvel described as a minimal group division. And if we consider the position the Russian Orthodox Church has come to occupy within the Russian state, and how deeply Dworkin's anti-cult structure has become embedded within it, the subsequent course of events no longer appears accidental. One need only look at the following footage to understand what the role of a dominant religion can become when it merges with state power. Think about it. The idea that some people are ours, while others are outsiders, that one faith stands above all others, begins with what appears to be a single harmless sentence in the preamble to a law. And it ends with what you see on the screen. The first stage does not look like a catastrophe. It is often presented to society as a reasonable measure. Stage 2, a label without a definition. On July 25, 2002, the federal law on counteracting extremist activity was adopted in Russia. Formally, this is a law against violence, hatred, and threats to the state. However, critics immediately pointed out its main danger. The language was so broad that it could be applied not only to actual calls for violence, but also to peaceful religious beliefs, sermons, religious texts, and missionary activity. And here a key paradox arises. The term sect does not appear in the extremism law at all. Moreover, in Russian federal legislation, the word sect has no legal definition and is not a legal category. The law uses the terms religious associations, religious groups, and religious organizations, but not sects. It is precisely this lack of a definition that became a convenient tool. First, a group is publicly branded a sect, depriving it of public trust. Only then does a legal mechanism come into play. Accusations of extremism, inspections, expert examinations, bans, and criminal cases. It is telling that Alexander Dworkin himself spoke out against introducing a legal definition of the term sect. After all, as soon as a definition appears, criteria appear. And where there are criteria, one has to prove the case rather than simply attaching a label. From an interview with Rossiyskaya Gazeta, if we introduce the legal term sect without backing it up with substantial body of evidence, then these very sects will overwhelm the courts with their lawsuits. Moreover, once a sect wins such a case, we will never again be able to call it a sect. This is also one of the key mechanisms of the anti-cult network. The label sect itself exists outside the legal framework, but its consequences become legal. The word sect is not a verdict, but it creates the conditions under which a verdict becomes possible. Stage 3. The expert enters governmental bodies. 2009. A turning point. Alexander Dworkin became the chairman of the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation under the Russian Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation. What actually happened? The anti-cult logic, which had previously existed primarily as a public, church, and media campaign, gained institutional access to the machinery of the state. And this is fundamentally important. In Dworkin's rhetoric, the label sect has long since transcended the boundaries of religion. It is used to brand not only believers, but also civic initiatives, educational, climate, and environmental projects, political movements, as well as individual politicians and public figures. In other words, the man who had spent years labeling disfavored movements as sects and destructive cults found himself alongside the state machinery, the very mechanism that determined which groups in Russia would be recognized as legitimate associations, and who would instead fall under suspicion, inspections, and pressure. Stage 4. The criminalization of preaching, 2016. The Yarovaya Law. Under the slogan of fighting terrorism, strict restrictions on missionary activity were introduced in Russia. From that point on, a sermon, the distribution of religious materials, a prayer meeting, or even a conversation about faith outside a specifically authorized location could become grounds for an administrative case and a substantial fine. And here is what is important. In Nazi Germany, Helen Gotthold was accused, among other things, of illegally holding Bible meetings. 72 years later, in another country and under another political system, a Bible meeting once again becomes a legal problem. First, as illegal missionary activity. Then after the ban on Jehovah's Witnesses in 2017, as grounds for searches, arrests, and criminal cases on charges of extremism. Stage 5. Ban and repression. On April 20th, 2017, the Supreme Court of Russia recognized the Administrative Center of Jehovah's Witnesses as an extremist organization, ordered its liquidation, and effectively banned the activities of all local organizations across the country. Following this, a wave of criminal prosecutions began, searches, the seizure of literature, arrests, and prison sentences. Reports emerged of torture and the deaths of people whose offense amounted to nothing more than praying, reading the Bible, and meeting with fellow believers. According to Memorial, as of June 29, 2026, at least 1,017 Jehovah's Witnesses had been subjected to criminal prosecution. 242 people were awaiting verdicts, and among the concluded cases, 16 individuals were listed as deceased. But behind every one of those numbers is a human life. Among those prosecuted are retirees, elderly people, people with disabilities, and those with serious medical conditions. 68-year-old Alexander Lubin, a Group 2 disabled man, went through pre-trial detention, investigation, and trial. He required oxygen for 16 hours a day. But this was not provided during his detention. After the verdict was handed down, his condition became critical, and he died in the intensive care unit. 74-year-old Lyudmila Shut, a retiree and Group 2 disabled woman who's used crutches, received a 4-year suspended sentence. Emergency medical services were called for her repeatedly following interrogations. In 2026, in Krasnodar Krai, among the convicted Jehovah's Witnesses were an 80-year-old man, a Group 1 disabled wheelchair user, and a believer with multiple sclerosis. The consequences of this have also been recognized at the international level. The United Nations Human Rights Committee found that Russia had violated the rights of Jehovah's Witnesses to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and association. The European Court of Human Rights has also issued judgments against Russia in cases involving Jehovah's Witnesses. And once again, 5 stages: 1997, 2002, 2009, 2016, and 2017. Each stage was presented to society as a reasonable protective measure. But step by step, the label turned into state policy, expert opinion became an instrument of pressure, and peaceful faith became grounds for the criminal prosecution of elderly, sick, and defenseless people. What is the ultimate result of society's acceptance of each new reasonable measure? The answer is provided by international human rights organizations, which have spent many years documenting the situation in Russia, where, according to the available body of evidence, the central axis of this process has become the anti-cult network, led by the man whose psychiatric history I analyzed in detail earlier. Let us look at what is happening to a country 30 years after it took one of its first, seemingly quite harmless, steps in 1997. Let us begin with the most fundamental point noted by researchers. The Constitution of Russia formally guarantees freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought and expression, the right to judicial protection, and the presumption of innocence, everything that is supposed to protect the individual. But independent human rights organizations describe the exact opposite picture. They document criminal prosecution for expressing opinions, participating in peaceful assemblies, holding religious services, and engaging in journalism and human rights advocacy. In other words, these rights exist only on paper. In reality, they no longer exist in Russia. Amnesty International, in its 2025-2026 annual report, describes arbitrary detention on fabricated charges, the lack of independent investigations, and unfair trials as defining features of the Russian law enforcement and judicial systems. Human Rights Watch, in its 2026 World Report, points to the further tightening of repression against civil society and the expansion of false or overly broad charges under the guise of ensuring security. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom describes the situation regarding religious freedom in Russia as dire. Authorities are criminalizing the activities of peaceful religious communities, including Jehovah's Witnesses, by using labels such as extremists, terrorists, and undesirable. At the same time, in 2025 and 2026, the blocking of websites, VPN services, messaging platforms, and mobile internet intensified. In March 2026, Human Rights Watch reported on a digital iron curtain in Russia, citing the blocking of 469 VPN services and prolonged mobile internet outages in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other regions. And now, the most difficult part, where all of this ultimately leads. In 2025, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation reported at least 258 documented cases of torture and ill treatment during the reporting period. Separately, the report notes 51 cases involving the use of punitive psychiatry. Let us focus on that second figure. Punitive psychiatry is the use of psychiatric diagnosis as a tool for persecuting dissenters. This is the exact mechanism that was used against Soviet dissidents. It is being used again, and it is being used in a country where, according to the available body of evidence, the principal ideologue of the system of persecution is a person with a documented psychiatric history. I will not interpret this fact. I'm merely placing it on the record. Draw your own conclusions. In 2026, Forum 18 reported that Jehovah's Witnesses have repeatedly alleged physical violence, inhuman treatment, and threats during raids conducted by the police, the Federal Security Service, the Russian National Guard, and other security agencies. Recall the person whose story opened this episode, the one who was tortured with an electric shock device. This is not an isolated incident. According to human rights organizations, this is a systematic practice. And this is what it all comes down to. Freedom of assembly is virtually suppressed. Academic researchers, including Zoe Knox, who analyzed the ban on Jehovah's Witnesses and others, associate these developments with overly broad legal provisions and the politicized protection of traditional values. In other words, with the very division into us and them that was embedded in the preamble to the 1997 law. This is exactly what I was talking about at the very beginning. No one agrees to torture immediately. No one wakes up one morning with the thought, let's send people to prison for reading the Bible. This is something people arrive at gradually, step by step, by agreeing each time only to something small, reasonable, and temporary. Now let's return to the question I asked you in the middle of this episode. What do you feel when you hear the word cult? Because it is precisely with this barely perceptible agreement that they are different, that they are worse, that the first step begins. The one that never looks like a catastrophe. The step that can look like a reasonable measure. Today, we have seen twice where these stages of exclusion, dehumanization, and legalized violence lead. In both cases, we saw the same sequence. First, an image of a dangerous group appears. Then, social exclusion. Then, restrictions, bans, criminal prosecution, and, finally, violence, which begins to be justified as protecting society. In Germany, from job dismissals to the gas chambers. In Russia, from a line in the preamble to the 1997 law to 258 documented cases of torture recorded by the UN. One could stop here and say, what a coincidence. How similar these two stories are. But I promised you there would be no coincidences. I promised you evidence. Therefore, one final, deeply uncomfortable question remains to be answered. Who carries out these stages? After all, laws do not appear on their own. Each stage must be proposed, justified by expert opinion, and pushed through by someone. And this is where the mask of concerned experts, who supposedly are merely informing the public, falls away. Because if you look closely at what the most active representatives of the anti-cult network are actually doing, a reoccurring pattern emerges. They do not limit themselves to criticizing sex. Year after year, country after country, they demand the same thing: new laws, new bans, new criminal provisions, expanded state powers, and increasingly strict control over those they declare dangerous. Their goal is not simply to debate religious minorities in the public sphere. Their goal is to embed their anti-cult ideology into state institutions, expert councils, the courts, prosecutor's office, the police, educational programs, and the media. And these conclusions are based not on speculation, but on their own words. I will cite just a few direct quotations. Let us begin with the center of the transnational anti-cult network, Moscow. Alexander Dworkin does not hide his goal. He explicitly calls the French law against sect and cults a good foundation. According to him, sects should be viewed not as religious organizations, but as a form of organized crime. And he considers state regulation of this sphere to be the correct position for the state. In an interview with Rossiyskaya Gazeta in 2007, he put it extremely concisely: a law is needed. And this is not an abstract proposal. Dworkin proposed specific measures, introducing into the Russian criminal code categories such as mind manipulation and psychological violence, so that they could be used to prosecute the very groups he himself declares to be sects and cults. Moreover, he even proposed creating a separate federal cabinet-level position for the coordination of work concerning destructive cults. And when Jehovah's Witnesses were banned in 2017, Alexander Dworkin commented that, in his opinion, the ban was not a violation of fundamental freedoms, but rather an important step toward preserving them. Think about this: depriving more than 100,000 people of the right to freely practice their faith. The searches, arrests, torture, convictions, and deaths that followed, affecting people including retirees, people with disabilities, and the seriously ill. All of this is presented as protection of freedom. This is exactly how the mechanism leading to totalitarianism works. Every stage of the catastrophe can be presented as caring for people. First comes the protection of traditions, then the fight against extremism, then the protection of society from dangerous sects. And in the end, it is peaceful believers who come under attack, whose offense amounts to nothing more than praying, reading the Bible, and meeting with fellow believers. And this is not an emotional assessment. The U.S. Department of State described Dworkin as an outspoken proponent of categorizing minority religious groups as extremist cults and totalitarian sects. But, I repeat, the most important thing here is not Dworkin himself. What matters is that he created an extensive network. His organization, Ratziers, the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, functions as an institutional lobby for anti-cult ideology. It sends its experts to court hearings, participates in drafting legislation, and works with the Ministry of Justice on matters related to the registration of religious organizations. It is, quite literally, a mechanism for embedding anti-cult ideology within the state apparatus. And standing beside Dworkin is his right-hand man, Archpriest Alexander Novopashin. He does not trouble himself with diplomatic language. Speaking about the groups and individuals he brands as cults and cultists, he says plainly,
They do not need to be controlled. They need to be officially recognized as extremists and banned.
So, the formula, recognize and ban, is a voice from Moscow. But if this were only about Russia, everything could be dismissed as a feature of an authoritarian state. The fusion of the church, the security agencies, and the repressive apparatus, as many researchers and human rights sources have documented. The problem is that this is not a Russian phenomenon. It is the international position of an entire network, and one of its key components is FECRIS, European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Sectarianism. In 2009, Alexander Dworkin simultaneously became the head of the Russian Expert Council under the Russian Ministry of Justice and the vice president of FECRIS. One person gained two massive, interconnected channels of influence. On one side, a Russian state body capable of influencing the fate of countless social groups, individuals, and religious minorities. On the other, a European organization with consultative status at the Council of Europe and the United Nations Economic and Social Council. So what is FECRIS trying to achieve? There is no need to speculate. The organization states it openly in the Our Objectives section of its official website. Participate in the creation of a European legal area with regard to issues related to the activities of totalitarian and destructive sects and cults. Drafting legislation is an explicitly stated objective, and this is not a new idea. At its founding conference in 1999, FECRIS adopted a joint declaration calling for the creation of permanent working groups in national parliaments and in the European Parliament to develop legislative measures against cults. In other words, lobbying for new legislation is, one could say, built into the very DNA of the organization. Now let us move to the national level. Italy, Luigi Corvaglia, who has worked closely with Dworkin, served as president of the Italian anti-cult organization, Centro Studi Abusi Psicologici, that is, the Center for the Study of Psychological Abuse, while simultaneously serving on both the board of directors and the scientific committee of FECRIS. Once again, we see the same dual role, a national activist and, at the same time, a node in an international network. And what does Luigi Corvaglia do? CSAP was directly involved in drafting an Italian bill to criminalize psychological manipulation, introduced in the Italian Senate in 2020. In essence, it is the Italian counterpart to the French law against sex. And according to the available body of evidence, activists within the Italian anti-cult network have attempted to push similar legislation almost every year. Now let us cross the Atlantic. Stephen Hassan, the very person to whom the entire previous episode was devoted, the author of the BITE model, which a number of sources characterize as pseudoscientific. And he, too, is engaged in far more than merely informing the public. As he states on his website, listen to his own words.
I believe that laws that prohibit the unethical use of undue influence should be expanded to include all instances in which people are placed under mind control.
Hassan, one might say, directly calls on the U.S. government to adopt stronger and broader laws. Different countries, different continents, but the demand sounds exactly the same. Where does this anti-cult obsession with legislation even come from? The answer to this question brings us back to where we started, to the line connecting Kunith and the Gestapo. Let us once again recall the theologian Johannes Aagaard, Dworkin's teacher, Haack's associate, and co-founder of that very dialogue center, from whose archives Dworkin brought suitcases full of photocopies. Here is what Aagaard himself said.
Mind-bending and soul-killing take place all over, and yet there are no laws against it. Under the cover of religious freedom, a deadly permissiveness has crept in. This is especially so in the United States, where the First Amendment is used to support all manner of evil exploitation in the name of religion.
When a person says that there are no laws against certain groups of people, they are effectively pointing to the next step, ensuring that such laws are enacted. To push for them, to create them, to convince the state that, without such laws, society is supposedly unprotected. This is exactly what the anti-cult network continues to do today, turning a label into a legal norm, fear into criminal offense, and prejudice into a mechanism of the state. The continuity of the method is clearly visible here. What once began with lists of dangerous groups and was handed over to institutions such as the Gestapo returns decades later in a different form, as draft legislation, expert councils, parliamentary initiatives, and new restrictions in modern states. Only now, it does not sound like a state dictatorship. It is presented as supposedly protecting children, the family, society, and freedom. But the result remains the same. The state is encouraged to legalize ever broader powers to exert pressure on those who have already been declared dangerous. Thus, all the information analyzed leads to the following conclusion. The anti-cult movement operates as a transnational lobbying network. It simultaneously employs legislative and administrative mechanisms to impose state restrictions on religious minorities that representatives of this same network have already classified as destructive sects or totalitarian cults. The analysis shows that the key figures within the anti-cult network are connected not only by personal contacts, but also by a shared ideology, rhetoric, and institutional structures. This network does not merely talk about sex, nor does it simply claim to study religious groups and inform the public. For decades, it has consistently promoted legislation, expert mechanisms, and administrative practices that restrict people's rights and undermine the very foundations of a democratic society. We have already seen, through concrete examples, what such laws lead to. First, the label, then social isolation, followed by investigations, bans, criminal prosecutions, and ruined lives. Of course, one question remains. Who finances this entire network? If you look more closely, the answer to this question turns out not to be so well hidden. It is enough to look at the scale of the network's presence in the media. Through the media, the same labels have been repeated for years: sect, destructive cult, totalitarian organization. These words do not just describe, they shape public perception. They preemptively turn specific groups of people, whether religious, secular, educational, environmental, or political, into objects of suspicion. Of course, such organized and often coordinated media attacks must be financed by someone. And a logical question arises. Who pays for it? Who has an interest in it? Who is the beneficiary? Although the final answer to this question should be provided by the appropriate specialists, it is important to understand a financial trail remains a financial trail. No matter what schemes are devised, no matter how the origin of the funds is concealed, money always leaves a chain that can be traced. It has a source, a route, a recipient, a purpose, reporting, and actual use. And if it turns out that funds formally allocated for one purpose are, in practice, directed toward entirely different purposes, the question, who is financing this and why, becomes a matter for investigation. In media campaigns closely linked to the anti-cult network, a consistent pattern emerges. Following the arrival of resources, grants, partnership projects, expert platforms, or other forms of support, an information attack soon intensifies. And this attack does not appear spontaneous at all. The same figures appear at the same time. The same rhetoric is repeated, and the same accusations are voiced. Upon closer inspection, many of these accusations do not withstand scrutiny, but by that point, the label is already doing its work. Society is frightened. Paid media have amplified the narrative, and law enforcement agencies are provided with a convenient backdrop for exerting pressure. Such coordination rarely arises on its own. It requires resources, coordination, platforms, and people who have a stake in the outcome. Then another question arises. Who benefits from creating such destabilization and burdening law enforcement agencies with cases against peaceful religious associations or secular organizations? In countries where representatives of this network have achieved significant influence, and in some countries, that influence has reached a very serious level, their ideas penetrate further than they seem at first glance. This includes the circles of politicians elected by ordinary people, and even the halls of parliament, where, as it turns out, the constitutional rights and freedoms of citizens can also be violated. But amidst all these details, it is easy to lose sight of the main point, the reason why it is worth looking into this at all. After all, the fundamental question is, what does the work of this network ultimately lead to? The very laws, expert councils, and sect filters that this network has been building for decades. One might object, well, all right, they are proposing changes to the law. What is wrong with that? But we already know what lies at the end of this process. We know about the execution of Helen Gotthold by guillotine. We know about the yellow stars used to label Jews, about the purple triangles worn by Jehovah's Witnesses, about the red triangles worn by political prisoners. These were the symbols used to first separate people from the rest, then strip them of their names, dignity, and rights, and finally, reduce them to a camp category, an object of isolation, forced labor, torture, and extermination. Therefore, the question is not whether proposing changes to the law is good or bad. The question is something else. What kind of laws are they? Who is promoting them? Whom are they directed against? And what ideology do they ultimately serve? And so, the final question of today's episode is not addressed to historians. It is addressed to you. History has already shown us where these steps lead. We know every step. We know the names. We know how it all ends. And it does not begin with an order for arrests, not with a dawn raid, not with the guillotine. It begins with one barely perceptible shift within an ordinary person, with a quiet, almost imperceptible moment of agreement. They are different. They are worse. They are not like me. It is precisely this quiet acceptance that lay behind the step once taken by Helen's neighbor when he turned away from her on the street. He was an ordinary person. He simply accepted the label that had been imposed on him. He simply agreed and did not object. Will we allow history to repeat itself? The answer does not depend on Dworkin, or on Fekris, or on cult experts. The answer depends on how you react the next time you hear the word cult. Will you accept the label right away, or will you pause and ask yourself, do I actually know these people? Or have I simply been conditioned to fear them and view them as inferior to myself? Because where our willingness to view others as human beings ends, that's where the first step always begins. One that doesn't look like a disaster, one that might look like a reasonable measure. Be vigilant and stay human. And see you in the next episode.